Shawan, you mentioned earlier that you would like to share some reflections on some of the previous segments. I'm wondering if you would like to do that now.
Yes, I do. When I listen to your speaking about the history, there's a few things that caught my attention.
Okay.
So I want to talk to you a little bit more. Particularly, I think that as I listen to your many talk, everything you talk about has many more behind. And so I think that if we could pause a little bit and talk a little bit more about few things that I think it would be helpful for the reader. Yeah. Okay.
Some of the stories.
Yeah. First of all, I like to talk to you about, you say something that that you no longer call yourself family therapist. And you said that that you just do, when people come, you sort of have conversation and work with them. And I'm thinking that my training was marriage and family therapy, and I often call myself family therapist. And so this is really about like a professional identity and how we sort of look at what we do. And when you say that, it's quite intriguing for me. So can you say a little bit more about that? You no longer call yourself family therapist.
Sure.
Yeah.
That over the years, as my ideas and practices has changed, my professional identity, or at least that I give myself, has shifted as well. And one of the things that began to happen with our group is that we began to realize that we were using some of the same assumptions, some of the same ways of practicing with people other than families. So what we began to think is that family therapy in general had become much too limiting a term, that people only thought about working with families or focusing with families, and that family therapy, since the very beginning of family therapy, with its system perspective, offered many concepts and had many applications across various human systems. Whether you were working with a family, an individual, a couple, a work team, a whole organization, or a community, that you didn't need to give up working with families, but you needed to be able to think that if you so choose, or so chose, that you could use the same kinds of practices, the same concepts with other configurations of people.
So how would you call yourself if we talk about professional identity? I know sometimes having a name might limit what we do, but I just wonder.
That's a very good question. Sometimes I use the broad term consultant.
Okay.
Sometimes I just think, again, of myself as someone who helps people with what they want help with. What I find, though, is that I tend to call myself whatever seems to be appropriate and more fitting or coherent with the context or with the person or persons that I'm working with. So if an organization invites me to come in and work with them and they call me a consultant, then that's fine. Sometimes I work with a leader in an organization, and the leader might think of me as their leadership coach, or they might think of me as their leadership mentor. So again, it depends on what the context is and what the agenda is. Although I know many people make very clear distinctions between therapy, counseling, coaching, consulting, mentoring, teaching, for that matter.
So the name is really sort of based on the context that you will be working with.
Yeah, think of it as shifting identities.
Okay, I like that, shifting identity. It feels more flexible and also respecting to different contexts, different needs. It doesn't have to be one kind of identity. It could be multiple professional identities.
Yeah, because I wouldn't want to say to a leader who wanted a mentor, but I thought I was a coach, that, well, I can't mentor you, but I can coach you. I just wouldn't do that. I would want to hear more what he thought about the term coaching or mentoring, for that fact.
Yeah.
So that together we could agree what it is that we're wanting to accomplish together, and that what we call it or what I'm identified as is not that important.
And I'm thinking for you, you are able to do multiple identity, but maybe for some people who have not had a chance to learn about doing that, so how they shift also depending on what they know, what they feel comfortable to do.
Yes, and I think particularly younger people starting out in the field, it's important for them to develop an identity. Because you develop your own identity, or you think of it as your inner identity, and that's the identity that you want to portray or you want to project for others as they begin to think about you and what you do. I think what you want to be careful of is having a particular professional identity become a prison or become constraining, and that you lose your flexibility in terms of being able to think about what it is that you can do. So, for example, some family therapists, for ethical reasons that they often call boundaries or confidentiality, might be working with a family and decide that it would be helpful to spend some time with one member of a family for various reasons, but they might not do that because of their ideas about boundaries or confidentiality, and they might refer the family member to a colleague. I've met people who've been in family therapy before, or other kinds of therapy, where you might have a family of 5 members, each with their own individual therapist, and they've never met as a family. The therapists don't talk with each other. So I think a lot is lost there. You begin to have sort of these disconnected realities of what's the reality of this family. And you work with the person you're working with based on the reality that you develop from that work. So I guess to kind of summarize it is, how can you think about what you do and who you are in that doing in a way that allows you to be the most flexible and to be able to meet the client's needs as they express it, and not be bound by an identity or a description or what your colleagues might think, for that matter.
Okay. I like this conversation, that there's a lot of fruitful thought in the future. Yeah, okay, great. So my second thing that I'd like to talk to you about, actually it's probably coming from our introduction.
Okay.
And then you talk about independent thinker. You talk about how we can learn instead of like listening or copying whatever that you talk about or collaborative practice is conveying, that you kind of encourage the reviewer to be an independent thinker. And that really caught my attention, because I'm just thinking that in our cultural learning, we learn to be a student. You try to listen to your teacher, try to memorize what your teacher is talking to you about, you know. I mean, just culturally. I mean, I don't grow up in China. I grew up in Taiwan. But overall, we think that our teachers or someone like you are who founded this collaborative practice, and then to encourage us to be independent thinker, I find that's very intriguing. And I notice, like, students that I have been working with, how I'm just thinking like my people that I have been meeting and my student, and also that the way that I grew up, and then thinking about independent thinking or independent thinker, it's quite intriguing for me. So I'd like you to talk a little bit more about what do you mean by independent thinker, and also kind of realizing maybe part of our cultural context, it's not something being encouraged to practice. And here we get a chance to learn about collaborative, and you encourage us to be independent thinker. Can you talk more about that?
Sure. The first thing that I'm thinking about, Shishuan, as you're talking, is that you have a very good memory and you pay very careful attention to what a person is saying, and particularly to their words. And in terms of your going back to ask me to say more about something that I said in the introduction, is a very beautiful illustration of one of the things that I was talking about in an earlier segment, when I said how to maintain coherence with what the person that you're speaking with is talking about, and find a pause in the conversation to perhaps go back to something that you want to go back to, or ask about something that you've just thought about. So this is a beautiful example of that we've paused, and now we're coming back to something that was said earlier. So I'm more than happy to say more about that. I think it has to do with two things. One, the whole postmodern invitation to always be skeptical, questioning, and doubting of universal truths, and of the idea that you can put knowledge or information or reality or expertise into the head of another person. So it's connected with that to help us remember that that cannot happen, that we cannot duplicate what the teacher, for example, has said or illustrated, that we can only interact with what they have offered us, and we're contributing what we bring to that conversation or that activity in terms of our own beliefs, our own values, our own culture, our own history. And that what we will create will be unique for each of us. And that I think that's the beauty in learning. I think that learning is much more relevant and much more easily sustained when the learner participates. And I think to participate, you have to be independent from, not separate from, because if you think in terms of learning as relational learning, we learn in relationships, either with each other, like here, or in a classroom, or from the pages of a book with the imagined author. So I connected also with my ideas about collaborative learning or collaborative education, which is learner-centered. And again, I think learner-centered learning is more meaningful and has more sustainability. Does that help, or would you like me to say something in addition?
So this independent thinker is related to the orienting assumption, some of the postmodern ideas. And then you talk about also relational learning, in learning in the community. So independent doesn't mean remove away.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. But it also means that how we position ourselves in the world, but always in the relationship. Yeah.
Yeah, that you're not learning independently.
Yeah.
But you're not dependent on the notion that you can duplicate or replicate what the author of the textbook has said or written, or what your professor in a classroom has said or demonstrated.
Yeah. That as we talk about this independent thinker also got me to think about voices, like inner voices. Do you think they are related?
I think there is a relationship, because I think when you're not, if you're thinking in terms of rote memory and trying to duplicate, you're concentrated on that kind of structured learning. You're concentrated on getting it right. And you lose the opportunity, I think, or it interferes with the opportunity to be able to be more self-reflective and have your own rich inner conversation and interact with what they're saying, and therefore be creating something unique for you.
I'm just thinking that when people have chance to learn about collaborative practice or postmodern ideas, and people begin to talk about their own voices instead of just listening to teachers' voices, that process itself, people are practicing the independent thinking.
Well, you are, yeah. And maybe using the word independent wasn't a good choice. I'm not sure because of the way that we usually think of independent. But yes, you want to be able to interact with your own voice, and you want to be able to interact with the voices, say, in a classroom of other members. That I think it's important to be engaged with your own inner voice and to be able to express that voice, both preferably in written form by writing or typing into the keyboard, or by talking with colleagues or talking with your teacher or some other conversational partner. Because that in itself is part of the generative process of creating new meaning and understanding and creating new learning. So, for example, you cannot duplicate a thought by expressing it out loud or by writing it on paper. That you are further creating that thought as you're expressing it. You're choosing words, you're choosing ways in which to express yourself to best communicate to yourself on paper or to another out loud what that thought was. So you're recreating the thought as you express it.
You know that as I listen to you, a term come out. It's like respecting voices, because voices has not been allowed to sort of be present or to be listened to. So I kind of relate respecting voices to independence.
It's interesting because that makes me go back to the conversation statue, the photo that I showed of the two people deeply engaged in conversation from Havana, Cuba. And in one of the descriptions that I read about it is that just having that statue in that major, major plaza, major park, and the title of it, Conversation, emphasizes how people in Cuba were not able to have a voice since 1959.
Wow.
Until some of the shifts more recently.
Wow.
So it signifies the importance of conversation, which is important in people's lives. And there they were talking about the importance of conversation in the life of Cuban people. And I think I would say that in many places around the world. Being in conversation with someone else.
Yes.
Like when we were talking with the man last night, the businessman, and he was talking about meeting with his friends, and we said, what do you do? And he says, we have conversations, we talk with each other.
Yes.
Just the importance of that kind of human exchange and connection.
Okay, good. Thank you for sharing your thoughts about this, because somehow it just caught my attention. I want to have a dialogue with you.
Well, thanks for sharing your reflections.
Thinking about this more.
And have another reflection.
Okay. The next one, when you talk about shifting interest, and you talk about hermeneutics, social construction, and language, and as you talk, and I just remember years ago, one of you and Harry's article is quite people, which is humans as a linguistic system, because I think shifting interest, that article has played a very significant role in inviting us to think differently about system. And I'd like you to maybe talk a little bit about that, what's important about that article. The reviewer has a chance to get a little bit idea, and then they can maybe read the article later on.
Yeah, we'll have to see if it's been translated to Chinese.
Yeah.
That's an article that Harry and I published in 1988, and it was really kind of the public viewing, or kind of the coming out of this ideological, or I guess I should say epistemological shift in our thinking. And before that, we had drawn heavily on general systems theory, cybernetic systems theory, both first order and second order cybernetic systems theory. And we began to think that it didn't fit with our work, because these were more mechanical systems, more mechanical ways of thinking about people and what we do together. And because of our interest in language, which I mentioned and talked about a little bit in an earlier segment, we began to think in terms of, we are people together with each other in language. And so we began to shift from talking about systems in general to talking about human systems as linguistic systems. And then it just had a lot of the assumptions associated with it that are important for us today, although often we talked about them or wrote about them slightly differently. But there were some significant points in that article. I think that's where we first talked about not knowing the importance of the client's expertise, the importance of therapy being more of an insider endeavor, that the therapist and the client are creating together, rather than the therapist as an outsider who comes in with outsider knowledge that's imposed on the client. So there were some major shifts from that paper. And then since then, we began to think and move beyond the notion of human systems as linguistic systems. Just thinking in terms of systems in general was limiting. So we moved to thinking in terms of human beings being engaged with each other, living with each other, living with themselves as linguistic beings and as dialogical beings.
So the concept also has been shifting as well. Yeah, okay, great. I want to make sure a reviewer has the chance to listen to this critical.
Ahead to our resources page on this video, and that perhaps we need to also provide a list of articles or somehow highlight them, although we have a section called
reading.
Yeah, reading. So maybe we can highlight on the video PPT some of the readings that we think are most important.
And play a significant
because we
role.
mentioned the human systems article.
Yes.
You mentioned the client as the expert earlier.
Yes.
And also when we talk about collaborative learning more, we can highlight an article there when we talk about research more, etc.
Okay, good. And last question. You talk about you're been working with Harry Gulishan, and you talk about first being your supervisor, mentor, and later you work together. And I think that that's a very, very special story they share with us. And I'd like the reviewer to maybe know a little bit more about you and Harry, and what's important for you when you are with Harry. I mean, so anything you like to talk about, so people have a context, because Harry is no longer here, so something people can connect with you and Harry.
So maybe I'll say a few words about Harry Gulishan. Harry Gulishan was a psychologist who, by the time I met him, he was probably perhaps in his middle 40s. And by that time he had accomplished everything in his career that most people would aspire to. He had numerous awards. He had been on government committees. He had helped found organizations. He had helped create the dismantling of some prison systems for youth in the state.
Wow.
So he had been very, very, very,
Wow.
had a very, very accomplished career at that time. And of course, by the time I met him, he was very involved in the ideas of family therapy and had been one of the pioneers, of course. He was an extremely creative person. He was educated by the Catholic Jesuits, who really place a lot of emphasis on education, on learning, and particularly on philosophy. So he had a tremendous educational background. He was extremely well-read, and he was a very curious person. And I think that he either attracted curious people in his circle, or to join his circle, or he inspired curiosity for learning in other people, because he was truly a lifelong learner. And he could always surprise me. He could stand up and start talking about something and all of a sudden reference some book that I had never heard of or never heard him mention, but that obviously he had read and had been very meaningful to him. So he had a tremendous resource of ideas and information and concepts to draw from. He was also very creative and very engaging in his teaching and as a therapist. He was just, people marveled at his, when they watched his therapy sessions or participated in his classes. He was a very caring and very warm person, a very sensitive person, though he could certainly be very direct, very challenging, as well as very playful. He was a person that most people really liked, and he could engage with people. For example, I still to this day meet people who may have been at a conference with him and had a 5-minute conversation at breakfast, or a 5-minute conversation in the hallway of the conference facilities, and they remember that conversation to this day.
Wow.
And they describe it as it was as if I was the only person in the room that I had his full attention, and that I would see him maybe sometime later, weeks later, months later, years later, and he would remember me and what I said.
Wow.
He had a remarkable memory for people, and I think that has to do with the idea of curiosity and maintaining closeness to the other person's story. And being genuinely interested in another person, whether it's a 5-minute conversation with someone that you don't know, you think you'll never meet again, in the hallway at a conference, or whether it's someone that you have 20, 30, 40, 50 therapy sessions with. He had the same kind of memory, each kind of person, and their conversations.
Wow.
Wow. So I learned a lot from him. When I first was in the seminar, I was very engaged by his teaching style and his way of interacting with all of us, and his respectful way of challenging us, although some people didn't always experience it that way. I always did. And I think there are just a lot of things that are part of who I am now as a professional, as a coach, as a mentor, that I learned from him without even realizing in the moments that I was learning it.
Wow, wow. Thank you so much for sharing the story of Harry.
Okay.
And because I think you talk about him, and I think that if reviewer can hear from you about your experiences of him, it would help people to know who is Harry, and also that like someone that you respect and cherish very much, yeah. So it's
yeah. In his days, he was a very well-respected psychologist, and in terms of history, still is.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes. Thank you.
In the United States, particularly.
Yes. Thank you. Okay.